The next morning, Sarah Chen walked into the Internal Affairs office with a thick folder under her arm. Her hands were steady, but her heart was racing. After last night's incident with Tommy Lin, she knew she couldn't stay quiet any longer. Detective James Wilson looked up from his desk as she entered. He was an older man with gray hair and tired eyes that had seen too much in his 30 years on the force. "What can I do for you, Officer Chen?" Sarah placed her folder on his desk. "Sir, I have evidence of widespread corruption in the Brighton district. Officers are taking payoffs from gang members, calls for backup are being deliberately delayed, and arrests are being covered up." Wilson opened the folder and slowly flipped through her carefully organized notes, photos, and incident reports. His face gave nothing away, but Sarah noticed his fingers tightening on the paper edges. "This is quite detailed, Officer Chen," he said finally. "Particularly your notes about Tommy Lin's arrest last night." He paused, studying her face. "You do understand what you're getting yourself into?" "Yes, sir," Sarah replied firmly. "I became a cop to protect people, not to look the other way." Wilson sighed heavily. "Come back tomorrow morning. I'll need time to review this properly." But when Sarah returned the next day, she found a different detective at Wilson's desk. Her folder was nowhere to be seen, and no one seemed to know where Detective Wilson had gone. Later that afternoon, Sarah's partner of 2 years, Mike Rodriguez, stopped by her desk. His usually friendly face was tight with worry. "I put in for a transfer," he said quietly. "You should do the same, Sarah. These people you're messing with, they're dangerous." Sarah looked up at him. "You knew about the payoffs, didn't you?" Mike wouldn't meet her eyes. Just be careful, okay?" He walked away, leaving Sarah alone in the busy office. Over the next few days, Sarah noticed changes. Her regular informants stopped taking her calls. Shop owners who used to greet her warmly now hurried inside when they saw her coming. Even the coffee shop where she got her morning coffee suddenly lost her usual order. But Sarah wasn't entirely alone. Mrs. Lee, who ran the small grocery store on Pine Street, secretly passed her a note while she was buying lunch. It read, "Back door, 8 p.m. That evening, Sarah parked her personal car 3 blocks away and walked to the grocery store, staying in the shadows. Mrs. Lee was waiting at the back door and quickly ushered her inside. "My son Jason," Mrs. Lee whispered. "He works at the Golden Dragon restaurant. He sees things. Bad things. Police officers meeting with gang members late at night. Money changing hands. Last week, he recognized one of them, Officer Phillips from your precinct." Sarah's mind raced. Phillips was in charge of evidence logging for drug cases. "Does your son have proof?" Mrs. Lee nodded. "He takes pictures with his phone, but he's scared. We all are." "The gangs?" "Not just the gangs," Mrs. Lee cut in. "Last month, my property taxes suddenly tripled. When I went to City Hall to complain, they said it was a computer error. It was fixed the next day, but the message was clear." Sarah understood. The corruption went beyond the police department, reaching into City Hall itself. She took out her notebook and wrote down the details. "More people want to help you," Mrs. Lee continued, "but they need to know they'll be protected." "I'll find a way," Sarah promised. As she walked back to her car that night, Sarah felt eyes watching her from the darkness. A black SUV with tinted windows drove past slowly. She recognized it as belonging to the Shadow Boys. Her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Back off while you still can." But Sarah had made her decision. Opening her trunk, she pulled out a small fireproof safe. Inside were copies of all her evidence, including a USB drive with photos and recordings. Tomorrow, she would start building a network of people who still believed in justice. A group of teenagers watched her from across the street, their red bandanas marking them as King Street crew members. Instead of looking away, Sarah met their gaze steadily. One of them nodded slightly, a sign of respect, or perhaps a warning. The war for Brighton District's soul was just beginning, and Sarah Chen was ready to fight. The call came at 11:30 p.m. on a rainy Tuesday night. Sarah Chen was just finishing her paperwork when the dispatcher's voice crackled over the radio. "Domestic disturbance at 247 Elm Street, apartment 4B. Any units in the area please respond." Sarah recognized the address. It was in the heart of King Street crew territory. She carried her radio, Officer Chen responding. Be advised, Officer Chen, the dispatcher added, backup units are unavailable at this time. Of course they were, Sarah thought bitterly. She'd learned that unavailable usually meant someone had been paid to stay away. The apartment building was old and dark, with graffiti marking the territory of the King Street crew. As Sarah climbed the stairs to the 4th floor, she heard crying coming from 4B. She knocked on the door. Police, is everything okay in there? The crying stopped. After a moment, a young girl's voice called out, "Please help." Sarah tried the handle. The door was unlocked. Inside, she found a teenage girl huddled in the corner of a small living room. Her left eye was swollen shut, and blood trickled from her split lip. "I'm Officer Chen," Sarah said softly, kneeling beside the girl. "What's your name?" "Maria Rodriguez," the girl whispered. "I'm 16. Sarah's heart sank. She knew that name. Maria was the younger sister of Carlos Rodriguez, a high-ranking lieutenant in the King Street crew. "Who did this to you, Maria?" The girl shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "I can't. They'll kill me if I tell." Sarah heard footsteps in the hallway. Heavy boots, multiple people. She quickly moved Maria behind her and drew her weapon, facing the door. 3 men entered. The first was Carlos Rodriguez himself, his face twisted with anger. Behind him were 2 other gang members, both carrying guns poorly hidden under their jackets. "This is none of your business, officer," Carlos said coldly. "Maria just had a little accident, right, sister?" Maria whimpered behind Sarah. "She needs medical attention," Sarah said firmly, her gun still trained on Carlos. "I'm taking her to the hospital." "You don't understand how things work here." Carlos stepped closer. "This is family business. Walk away, and maybe we forget about seeing you tonight." Sarah didn't move. "Your sister is coming with me." The tension in the room could have been cut with a knife. Sarah knew she was outnumbered, but something in her steady gaze made Carlos hesitate. Finally, he waved his men back. "Take her, but this isn't over." Sarah helped Maria to her patrol car, her heart pounding but her hands steady. At the hospital, while Maria was being treated, Sarah received a text from an unknown number. "Meet me at St. Michael's Church. Come alone." See. 2 hours later, Sarah sat in the empty church, wondering if she'd made a mistake coming here. Then Carlos stepped out of the shadows. He was alone. "Why did you help her?" he asked. "Because it was right," Sarah replied simply. "Why did you let me?" Carlos sat heavily in a pew. "They're using my sister to control me. The shadow boys, corrupt cops, city officials, they're all working together now. They wanted me to prove my loyalty by..." He couldn't finish the sentence. "By hurting your own sister," Sarah completed quietly. "I can't do it anymore." Carlos's voice broke. "But if I don't play along, they'll kill her. They'll kill me too." Sarah took out her notebook. "Tell me everything." For the next hour, Carlos talked. He revealed names, dates, locations, a complex web of corruption that went higher than Sarah had imagined. City council members, judges, even a state senator were involved in a massive money laundering operation. "Why are you telling me this?" Sarah asked finally. "Because you're the only cop who ever stood up to us," Carlos said. "The only one who couldn't be bought. You stood up. Keep Maria safe. And watch your back. They'll come for you next." As Sarah drove home that night, she knew she had crossed a line. There was no going back now. The evidence in her notebook could bring down not just street gangs, but powerful people who thought they were untouchable. She just had to stay alive long enough to use it. Sarah Chen felt something was wrong the moment she started her patrol that evening. The streets of Brighton District were too quiet. Even the usual drug dealers on the corners were missing. She checked her phone again. The anonymous tip had come an hour ago. "Drug shipment tonight. Warehouse 17, Harbor District, midnight." The message included photos of boxes being unloaded from a truck, with both King Street crew and Shadow Boys members working together. Her patrol car's radio suddenly crackled. "Officer Chen, suspicious activity reported at Harbor District, Warehouse 17. Please investigate." Sarah's grip tightened on the steering wheel. The dispatcher's voice was unfamiliar, and this wasn't how calls usually came in. Still, she had to check it out. "Dispatch," Requesting backup at the location, she said. All units currently occupied. Proceed with caution. Of course they were occupied, Sarah thought. Just like they'd been occupied every other time she'd needed help lately. The harbor district was a maze of old warehouses and empty buildings. Most of the businesses had moved to the new port years ago, leaving this area almost abandoned. As Sarah drove between the buildings, she noticed all the streetlights were out. This wasn't a coincidence. She parked her patrol car a block away from Warehouse 17 and approached on foot, staying in the shadows. Her flashlight revealed fresh tire tracks leading into the building. Through a broken window, she could see movement inside. Sarah reached for her radio to call for backup one more time, but there was only static. Her phone showed no signal. They had planned this well. Just then, she heard engines roaring to life. 3 black SUVs with tinted windows emerged from different directions, their headlights blazing, surrounding her position. Car doors opened, and men with red bandanas stepped out, King Street crew members. From the other direction came figures wearing dark hoodies, shadow boys. Officer Chen, a familiar voice called out. Sergeant Martinez stepped into the light, alongside Tommy Lin and several other officers she recognized from her precinct. You should have listened when we told you to back off. How much did they pay you, Martinez? Sarah asked, her hand on her weapon. Was it worth betraying everything that badge stands for? You don't understand, Martinez laughed. This isn't about money anymore. This is about power. The old way of doing things is over. Either you're with us, or you're against us. Sarah counted quickly. At least 20 gang members, plus 5 corrupt officers. They had her completely surrounded. So what's it going to be, Chen? Martinez asked. There's still a place for you in the new order. All you have to do is destroy those files you've been collecting. Sarah's mind raced. During her years on the force, she had memorized every alley, every escape route in this district. She knew that behind her, just past the old fishing equipment warehouse, there was a narrow passage that led to the water. I have copies of everything, Sarah said loudly, buying time as she took small steps backward. If anything happens to me, they go straight to the FBI. She's bluffing, Tommy Lin called out. Take her down. Sarah turned and ran just as the first shots rang out. She ducked behind a stack of old shipping containers as bullets pinged off metal around her. In the darkness, their poor aim was her advantage. She sprinted through the narrow passage she remembered, hearing shouts and footsteps behind her. The gang's bulky SUVs couldn't follow through this route. The corrupt officers knew the area too, but not as well as she did. Sarah reached into her pocket and pulled out her phone. Before leaving home, she had started a recording app. The entire conversation with Martinez was now saved, including his confession. More shots echoed through the night. A bullet grazed her arm, but she kept running. She could see the water ahead, and beyond it, the lights of the city's main port where real police officers, honest ones, would be patrolling. Behind her, she heard Martinez shouting orders and gang members arguing about which way she went. Sarah smiled grimly. She wasn't their prey tonight. She was their hunter, and she had just caught them all in their own trap. Now she just had to survive long enough to prove it. Sarah Chen's lungs burned as she ran through the maze of warehouses. Blood trickled down her arm where the bullet had grazed her. Behind her, she could hear the shouts of gang members and corrupt officers getting closer. She rounded a corner and found herself facing the old fishing warehouse. Through its broken windows, she spotted movement. A group of homeless people huddled inside, trying to stay out of sight. They were innocent civilians who could get caught in the crossfire. Making a split-second decision, Sarah darted into the warehouse. Police, she whispered urgently to the group. You need to hide. Now. An elderly man with a gray beard pointed to a hidden trapdoor in the floor. Down here, officer. We use it during storms. Sarah helped the group, 3 men, 2 women, and a teenage boy, into the underground storage room. As she closed the trapdoor, she heard footsteps approaching. Check every building. Martinez's voice echoed outside. She's here somewhere. Sarah quickly assessed her surroundings. The warehouse was filled with old fishing nets, broken crates, and rusty equipment. In her years patrolling this area, she had often studied these abandoned buildings. Now, that knowledge would save her life. She pulled out her phone and pressed a few buttons. Suddenly, Her police radio, which she had hidden near the warehouse entrance earlier while running, crackled to life several buildings away. The sound drew some of her pursuers in that direction. Split up, she heard Tommy Lynn shout, "Cover all exits." Sarah smiled grimly. That's exactly what she wanted them to do. Using the fishing nets, she quickly set up trip wires between the old crates. She positioned herself on the second floor, where old walkways gave her a clear view of the entrance. Her gun was drawn, but she knew she had to be careful with her remaining ammunition. The first two shadow boys entered, weapons ready. In the darkness, they didn't see the nets. They went down hard, cursing as they got tangled. "She's in here," one of them shouted. More gang members rushed in. Sarah used her flashlight to temporarily blind them, then moved quickly to another position. In their confusion, they started shooting at shadows, wasting ammunition. "Stop shooting, you idiots," Martinez commanded, entering the warehouse. "You'll hit each other." Sarah's voice echoed through the building. "Drop your weapons and surrender. This whole thing is being recorded." "You're outnumbered, Chen," Martinez shouted back. "There's no way out." "Maybe," Sarah replied, moving again. "But I've got all the evidence I need. Your confession, the setup, everything. It's already uploaded to a secure server." She saw uncertainty spread among the gang members. Some of them started backing away. "She's lying." Tommy Lynn yelled, "Find her." A King Street crew member moved toward the back of the warehouse, right where Sarah wanted him. He stepped on a loose board she had carefully positioned. The board swung up, hitting him hard. More gang members were retreating now. The Shadow Boys and King Street crew began arguing, each blaming the other for the failed trap. Suddenly, real police sirens wailed in the distance. "Who called the cops?" Martinez shouted. Sarah allowed herself a small smile. Before entering the warehouse district, she had called an old friend from the academy who now worked at the main port. The signal blocking equipment the gangs were using didn't cover that far. "Last chance to surrender," Sarah announced. "The recording of everything that's happened tonight is already in safe hands. If anything happens to me, it goes public." She saw Martinez grab Tommy Lynn's arm. "We need to get out of here. Now." The warehouse erupted into chaos as gang members and corrupt officers fled in different directions. Sarah maintained her position, making sure they all left. Once the building was clear, she quickly retrieved the hidden recording device she had planted earlier and helped the homeless people out of the trapdoor. The elderly man looked at her with respect. "We saw everything, officer. We'll testify if you need us to." Sarah nodded gratefully. She could hear more sirens approaching. The night wasn't over yet, but she had done it. She had stood her ground, protected innocent people, and gathered the evidence she needed. Now it was time to make sure justice was served. The morning sun cast long shadows across Brighton district as news vans lined up outside the police station. Sarah Chen sat in the chief's office, her arm freshly bandaged, watching the chaos unfold on the TV mounted on the wall. Breaking news. Female officer exposes massive police corruption. The headline read. Images from her confrontation at the warehouse, captured by security cameras she hadn't known about, played across the screen. Police Chief Anderson, a stern woman in her 50s who had flown in from headquarters that morning, turned off the TV and faced Sarah. "Officer Chen, you've started a firestorm." "I did what was necessary, ma'am," Sarah replied, her voice tired but firm. 4 officers arrested, including a sergeant. 2 city council members under investigation. Both major gang leaders gone into hiding. The chief shook her head. "And now we have reporters camping outside every precinct in the city." A knock on the door interrupted them. Agent Torres from the FBI entered, carrying a thick file. "Officer Chen," he said, "your recordings and evidence are solid gold. The hidden camera footage from the warehouse matches your story perfectly. Those homeless witnesses you protected, they've all given statements." He smiled. "You've handed us the biggest corruption case the city has seen in decades." But Sarah wasn't celebrating. "What about Maria Rodriguez? Carlos's sister?" "She's safe," Agent Torres assured her. "We moved her and her brother into witness protection this morning. Carlos is ready to testify against both gangs and the corrupt officials." Chief Anderson stood up. "Officer Chen, I'm placing you on paid leave effective immediately." Sarah started to protest, but the chief raised her hand. It's for your own protection. We've received credible threats against you and your family. Sarah's heart sank. Her parents. In all the chaos, she hadn't had time to warn them. Already taken care of, Agent Torres said, reading her expression. FBI agents picked them up an hour ago. They're in a safe location. As if on cue, Sarah's phone buzzed with a text from her mother. We're okay. So proud of you, daughter. Outside the office, reporters surged forward as Sarah emerged. Camera flashes blinded her as questions came from all directions. Officer Chen, how long have you known about the corruption? Did you fear for your life? Are there more corrupt officers still on the force? Sarah pushed through the crowd, Agent Torres clearing a path beside her. At the bottom of the steps, she stopped. There, gathered behind the police barrier, were faces she recognized. Shop owners, street vendors, residents of Brighton District. Mrs. Lee from the grocery store. The elderly homeless man from the warehouse. They were all applauding. A young girl pushed through the crowd, holding a hand-drawn picture. It showed a police officer standing against a group of shadowy figures. Thank you for protecting us, she said, handing it to Sarah. Later that evening, in a secure FBI safe house, Sarah watched more news coverage of the unfolding scandal. Tommy Lynn had been caught trying to flee the country. Sergeant Martinez was cooperating with authorities, naming names up the chain of command. The Shadow Boys were turning against the King Street crew, their alliance shattered. Her phone kept buzzing with messages from fellow officers, some apologizing for not backing her up sooner, others sharing information about corruption they'd witnessed but been afraid to report. Agent Torres entered with fresh coffee. You should get some rest. Tomorrow's going to be another long day. What happens now? Sarah asked. Now we build a case that will clean up this city for good. But there's something else you should know. He handed her a letter. The FBI Academy is interested in your experience. They think you'd make an excellent instructor in anti-corruption tactics. Sarah looked at the letter, then out the window at the city lights. My place is here, she said quietly. This isn't over yet. Brighton District needs officers it can trust. Torres nodded respectfully. Get some sleep, Officer Chen. Your city's going to need you strong. As Sarah lay in bed that night, she thought about all the events that had led to this moment. One person standing up for what was right had started a chain reaction. Change was coming to Brighton District, and she would be there to see it through. Her last thought before drifting off to sleep was of that young girl's drawing. Sometimes, one officer really could make a difference. 2 weeks had passed since the warehouse confrontation. Sarah Chen stood at the back of the crowded courtroom, watching as Tommy Lynn and Sergeant Martinez were led in wearing handcuffs. The preliminary hearing was about to begin, and the tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. District Attorney Rebecca Torres, a sharp-eyed woman in her 40s, stood before Judge Williams. Your Honor, the state is prepared to present evidence of a criminal conspiracy involving police officers, gang members, and city officials that has plagued Brighton District for years. Sarah noticed Carlos Rodriguez sitting in the witness box, looking nervous but determined. His sister Maria watched from the gallery, her bruises now healed. They both nodded at Sarah when they saw her. The evidence was overwhelming. Sarah's recordings played through the courtroom speakers, crystal clear and damning. Security camera footage from the warehouse showed the ambush attempt. Financial records revealed millions of dollars in bribes and laundered money. One by one, former gang members stepped forward to testify. They described how corrupt officers would tip them off about raids, help them transport drugs, and frame innocent people to meet arrest quotas. Mrs. Lee testified about the intimidation of local businesses. The homeless witnesses from the warehouse described what they had seen that night. Even Officer Phillips, the evidence room supervisor, had turned state's witness, explaining how he had helped cover up crimes for years. During a break in the proceedings, Agent Torres pulled Sarah aside in the courthouse hallway. We just arrested 3 more city council members, he whispered. And the state senator is cooperating. This goes higher than anyone imagined. Sarah watched as another group of defendants was led past them in chains. Shadow Boys gang members who had tried to run but were caught at the Canadian border. What about the King Street crew? She asked. Most of them surrendered this morning, Torres replied. After Carlos's testimony, they knew it was over. We're offering deals to the lower-ranking members who help us catch the leaders. Back in the courtroom, Tommy Lynn's expensive lawyer tried to discredit Sarah's evidence. Officer Chen acted alone, without proper authorization. She endangered civilians and violated numerous department procedures. But Chief Anderson took the stand next. Officer Chen showed exceptional courage and judgment. She followed her oath to protect and serve when others abandoned theirs. The department stands behind her actions completely. Martinez slumped in his chair as his former boss testified. He looked old and defeated, nothing like the confident sergeant who had tried to have Sarah killed. By late afternoon, Judge Williams had heard enough. There is more than sufficient evidence to proceed to trial. All defendants will be held without bail. As the courtroom cleared out, Sarah felt a hand on her shoulder. It was Mrs. Lee. "My son Jason got a job at the new youth center," she said proudly. "The one they're building where the shadow boys used to deal drugs. He wants to help keep kids away from gangs." Sarah smiled. Already, Brighton District was changing. In the 2 weeks since the arrests, serious crime had dropped by 60%. New businesses were opening. People were no longer afraid to walk the streets at night. Outside the courthouse, reporters waited with their cameras. But this time, Sarah didn't push past them. She had a message to deliver. "Today, justice is being served," she said into the microphones. Not because of one officer, but because an entire community finally said enough. The real heroes are the witnesses who came forward, the residents who refused to be intimidated, and the honest officers who chose to do what's right. She looked directly into the cameras. "To anyone who thinks they can buy police protection or terrorize our neighborhoods, your time is over. Brighton District belongs to its people now." That evening, Sarah drove through her patrol route, now back on active duty. She passed the old warehouse, where workers were converting it into a community center. The street corners once controlled by gangs were now occupied by families enjoying the warm evening. Her radio crackled. "Officer Chen, suspicious activity reported at 5th and Pine." "Copy that," she responded. "En route." But this time was different. No more mysterious delays, no more missing backup. 2 other patrol cars immediately radioed that they were also responding. Sarah smiled as she turned on her lights and siren. This was how it was supposed to be. This was justice served. 6 months had passed since the mass arrests that changed Brighton District forever. Sarah Chen walked through the newly renovated police station, now wearing the badge of a detective. The walls, once bare and gray, displayed photos of community events and newspaper headlines documenting the district's transformation. Detective Chen called a familiar voice. Mrs. Lee's son Jason ran up to her, now wearing a police cadet uniform. He was part of the first class of local youth recruited into the department's new community officer program. "How's the training going?" Sarah asked, smiling at his enthusiasm. "Great. 20 of us graduated from the basic course yesterday. We're already helping with the neighborhood watch programs." Sarah nodded approvingly. After the corruption scandal, Chief Anderson had implemented her suggestion to recruit officers directly from the community they would serve. The results were already showing. In her new office, Sarah looked at the morning reports. Crime rates in Brighton District had dropped by 80%. The old gang territories were unrecognizable, the abandoned warehouses converted into sports centers, job training facilities, and youth clubs. Her phone buzzed with a text from Carlos Rodriguez, now living under a new identity. "Maria got accepted to college. Thank you for everything." A knock on her door interrupted her thoughts. Agent Torres entered, looking pleased. "Final verdicts just came in," he announced. Tommy Lynn got 20 years. Martinez and the corrupt officers, 15 to 18 each. The state senator and council members, all guilty. Sarah picked up a framed photograph from her desk, the hand-drawn picture that young girl had given her 6 months ago. It now hung in every precinct across the city, a symbol of what one honest officer could accomplish. "There's more," Torres continued. "The FBI is using Brighton District as a model for anti-corruption programs nationwide. They want you to help train other departments." Before Sarah could respond, her radio crackled to life. "Detective Chen, you're needed at the community center. It's about the graduation ceremony." The community center, once the warehouse where Sarah had made her stand, was packed with people. On stage, 20 young police cadets, including Jason, stood in their new uniforms. In the audience, she recognized faces from the long struggle, Mrs. Lee, homeless witnesses who were now employed as building maintenance staff, Maria Rodriguez watching via video call from her college dorm. Chief Anderson stepped up to the podium. 6 months ago, Brighton District was a symbol of corruption and fear. Today, it's a model of community policing and citizen involvement. And it all started because one officer refused to look the other way. Sarah was called to the stage. Looking out at the crowd, she saw hope in their eyes instead of fear. When I first joined the force, she began, someone told me that one person couldn't change anything. But they were wrong. One person standing up for what's right can inspire others to do the same. One act of courage can start a movement. She turned to the new cadets. Your job isn't just to enforce laws. It's to earn and keep the trust of the people you serve. That trust is more valuable than any amount of money and more powerful than any gang. After the ceremony, Sarah walked her old patrol route. Shop owners waved from their stores. Children played freely in parks that were once drug corners. At the spot where she had first confronted the King Street crew, a new coffee shop had opened, run by former gang members who had chosen a different path. Her phone buzzed again. It was a message from Chief Anderson. FBI training program starts next month. You'll be teaching 2 days a week, still keeping your detective duties here. The next generation of officers needs to hear your story. Sarah stopped at the corner of Maple and Fifth, where everything had started. The old street sign had been replaced with a new one. Unity Square. A patrol car pulled up beside her. Officer Rodriguez. Mike, her former partner who had once told her to back off, rolled down his window. Detective Chen, he said hesitantly, I was wrong back then. About everything. Thank you for showing us all a better way. Sarah nodded, accepting his apology. As she watched him drive away, she thought about how much had changed. Brighton District wasn't just a different place. It was a symbol of what was possible when good people refused to give up. Her radio came to life. Detective Chen, assistance requested at Unity Square Community Center. On my way, she replied, smiling. There was still work to do, and she was ready for whatever came next. This wasn't just an ending, it was a new beginning.